So Charles Spencer finally opened the vault at O'Lourpe House. And what he found inside wasn't just one letter from Princess Diana. It was a whole sequence of them. 6 pale blue envelopes stacked in order. And the last one had no date, no seal. Just the name written in Diana's handwriting that nobody expected. And that detail alone, the name on that final envelope, is what makes everything about this story feel different the moment you hear it. Because for 30 years, the public narrative has been that Princess Anne and Diana never really understood each other. That they were cold, distant, maybe even hostile behind palace doors. But the contents of these letters and the way Anne handled them completely dismantle that version of events. And the weirdest part isn't even what Diana wrote. It's the fact that Anne has known about it since 1997 and never said a word. Before we get into the details, if you enjoy royal deep dives like this, hit subscribe to Crown Watch so you don't miss the next investigation. It helps more than you think. So, let's start with the actual discovery because the circumstances around it matter. Charles Spencer wasn't casually going through old boxes in the attic. He was in the library at O'Lourpe House, the family estate, sitting at this heavy walnut desk. And in front of him was a mahogany box that had been retrieved from a sealed vault beneath the foundation stones of the mansion. Not a filing cabinet, not a storage room. A vault cut into the stone under the building itself. That's the kind of place you put something when you need to be absolutely certain it won't be found by accident. Inside that box were the 6 envelopes. Pale blue paper, dark red wax seals pressed flat with deliberate care, each one dated in Diana's handwriting. And the date spanned from August 8th to August 28th, 1997, 3 days before she left for the Mediterranean, 3 days before the journey that ended in Paris. Now, the forensic examination of these letters took 48 hours. Charles Spencer brought in a senior document examiner, someone who specializes in authenticating historical manuscripts. They did ink pressure analysis, handwriting consistency checks, cross-referenced against hundreds of verified Spencer family documents, full signature authentication across every envelope. The verdict was unambiguous. Every letter was genuine. Every date was accurate. Every word was Diana's. But here's the thing that struck the examiners almost immediately. The handwriting changed across those 3 weeks. The early letters were careful, precise, almost legal in their composition. Diana was choosing her words deliberately, like she was building a record. The later letters moved faster. Urgency had entered the pen. And the final page, the one that wasn't even in an envelope, looked like it had been written in a single sustained movement. No revisions, no crossed-out sentences, just Diana writing without stopping. That shift in tone and speed tells you something important. Whatever she was documenting, it became more urgent as the days passed. So, what was in the letters? The first one, dated August 8th, outlined an internal administrative plan that Diana believed was being constructed around her. She had received information from a source inside the palace registry office, someone who operated quietly and at considerable personal risk. The information was detailed and specific. It described a plan not to remove Diana publicly, but to reduce her operationally security reductions, communications isolation, increased institutional pressure around her daily movements, and independent media access. The goal, according to what Diana wrote, was to make the cost of maintaining her public voice outside the palace communications infrastructure so high that it became unsustainable. And critically, she referenced a clause within an old Royal Marriages Act that could be used to progressively limit her access to William and Harry if she continued operating independently. That's the part that made the first letter read less like personal correspondence and more like a legal document. Diana was not venting. She was documenting. She sent that first letter through an informal network, not through Kensington Palace's formal correspondence infrastructure, because anything sent through official channels passed through layers of administrative review. Instead, she gave it to her personal chauffeur with instructions to handle it to Anne's head groom at Gatcombe Park. No signature, no record, no trace. From the stables, it went directly to Anne's desk. That route mattered because it bypassed every layer of palace oversight. Diana understood exactly how the system worked, and she built her own route around it. 3 days later, she wrote again, and this time the tone shifted. The second letter answered the question of why Diana was so afraid. It wasn't about her own public standing. It was about her son's. She believed the target of everything being constructed around her was not her voice, but her access to William and Harry. And she wrote too, and because she had assessed every person available to her inside the Windsor family and concluded with considerable clarity that and was the only one with the specific combination of courage and discretion that protecting her sons would require. That's a staggering thing to read. Diana, who had spent 16 years inside that institution, looked around at everyone available to her, and decided and was the person she trusted most. Not because they were close publicly, but because of what Diana had come to understand about Anne's character. But it's the third letter that really changes everything. It was folded twice, unsealed, no envelope, no wax. And in it, Diana wrote something she had never said publicly. She had misjudged Anne completely from the beginning. She had spent years reading Anne's distance as indifference, her formality as coldness, her refusal to perform warmth publicly as an absence of it privately. She had allowed the tabloid characterization to shape her own understanding, and she had been wrong. The final lines of that page included a sentence the forensic examiners noted separately in their report. I do not know whether you will ever read this, but if you do, I want you to know that I was wrong about you from the very beginning. That sentence written in Diana's own hand is now part of the historical record. It exists. It's been authenticated and it completely reframes 30 years of narrative about these two women. But there's more. In the final paragraph of that third letter, Diana told Anne about a repository, not the collection of letters Charles Spencer found, it's something separate. A body of material, letters, diary entries, private manuscripts held entirely outside the palace's archival oversight, maintained by personal trustees under a private instruction. Diana had written specifically to place it beyond the reach of any administrative mechanism the central household could deploy against her. And then the detail that changes everything. Diana had given Anne a key, not metaphorically physically a key to the location where that repository was held. Passed through the same informal network, arriving at Gatcombe Park through the stables onto Anne's desk without a single administrative record. Anne alone knew where it was. Anne alone had always known. So now you have to think about what that means. For nearly 30 years, Princess Anne has been sitting on a key to a repository of Diana's private papers. She's known about it since 1997. She read those letters the year they were written alone in her private study at Gatcombe Park. And she never told anyone, not the palace, not the press, not even her own family. Apparently, she just absorbed it. And while the tabloids spent 3 decades calling her cold and indifferent to Diana's legacy, and was quietly doing exactly what Diana had asked her to do, she was protecting William and Harry in the only way she could, by staying silent. The court's circular records actually show a pattern that the tabloids never reported. In the years immediately following 1997, Anne adjusted her charity appearances and official engagements. She made calendar amendments subtly but deliberately to ensure she was present at Windsor estate properties during William and Harry's academic holiday periods, half-term breaks, Easter weeks, Christmas recesses. She arrived in her private car, no press offices, no announcements, no documentation. She spent hours with the boys into quiet grounds, creating exactly the stable and grounded space Diana's letters had asked her to create. And she did all of it without ever once defending herself publicly against the narrative that she didn't care. That's the part that's genuinely hard to sit with and read those letters in 1997. She knew Diana had trusted her. She knew Diana had been wrong about her, and she also knew that if she ever produced those letters to correct the public record, it would have triggered consequences she had assessed were not hers to initiate. So she said nothing for 30 years. That's not coldness. That's a level of discipline most people can't even comprehend. Now the palace found out about all of this in 2026. And the timing is interesting because it wasn't Charles Spencer who forced the issue. It was actually a request from the master of the household. The palace wanted to conduct a comprehensive audit of all private correspondence files held at Gatcombe Park with the explicit intention of transferring any sensitive historical material to the central repository at Windsor Castle where it could be processed and restricted under the 50-year state privacy rule, and rejected that audit instantly. She informed the central registry clerks that her private safe contained personal family correspondence entirely separate from the state's administrative workflow. She refused to surrender the keys. The palace legal department reviewed their options, concluded they had no statutory grounds to compel compliance without initiating a court battle that would itself become the story, and quietly withdrew the request. But that standoff, The audit refused and the safe defended is what brought Charles Spencer to Gloucester for a meeting that no one outside that room knew was happening. Charles Spencer traveled by private car, no press announcement, no advance notice to the palace, no entry in any official engagement diary. He was shown directly to Anne's private study and he told her what he had concluded. The forensic authentication was complete. The letters were genuine. The false narrative surrounding Diana Anne had persisted for 30 years and the authenticated evidence now existed to correct it. He intended to proceed with publication. Then he placed a printed reproduction of that final sentence on the desk between them. The one about being wrong from the beginning. And this is where the story reaches its emotional center. Anne had read those words in 1997 alone in that same room with no witness and no record. She had folded the page, placed it in the safe, and carried it across every year that followed without once allowing its existence to alter her public composure. Now, Charles Spencer was sitting across from her, and the words were no longer hers alone. Those who have worked closely with and describe a particular quality of the way she receives information in consequential moments, a focused, unhurried stillness. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't ask clarifying questions. She looked at the reproduction of that final sentence, and for the first time in 30 years in the presence of another person, she did not hold it together completely. It wasn't dramatic, and is not a person for drama. There was no sound, no visible collapse, just a stillness that deepened past its usual point, a pause that extended beyond what the room had been expecting. And then she set both hands flat against the surface of the roll-top desk and looked out toward the window for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision that cost something real. 2 words. Proceed, Charles. Then she reached into the safe. She placed the key to the repository on the desk beside the reproduction of Diana's handwriting. And beside the key, something else. Something Charles Spencer had not been told to expect. A small piece of paper with an address written in Anne's own careful script, the location of the repository. The palace legal team learned about it the following morning, and it changed every assumption they had been working from. Now, the public reaction to all of this was immediate and it was massive. On Thursday morning, the front pages of British newspapers were filled with Diana's handwriting enlarged to a scale that made every word legible from a distance. The third letter's closing sentence was being read aloud on television. Constitutional historians were being interrupted mid-analysis by the emotional weight of what they were being asked to assess in real time. Royal correspondents who had covered the palace for decades were visibly recalibrating while speaking, reaching for language adequate to a collection of documents that had just reframed 3 decades of carefully managed narrative in the space of a single morning. And then there was the moment that defined the palace's most immediate crisis. William's private office at Adelaide Cottage received a communication from the King's advisors at Clarence House. The palace wanted to draft a joint family statement, one that would acknowledge the letters' historical significance while framing them gently as reflections of a bygone era of court tension the family had long since moved beyond. They wanted William's name attached to language that would provide the institution with diplomatic cover. William's response was delivered through his private secretary. He would not authorize his staff to participate in any communications campaign designed to minimize, reframe, or place comfortable institutional language around his mother's authenticated words. He fully respected the unbroken silence Princess Anna had maintained for 30 years to protect his childhood. He was not going to assist the central administration in constructing a narrative buffer around what Diana had written in her own hand. That refusal accomplished something lasting without William issuing a single public word. His silence communicated everything a formal statement would have said, and considerably more than a formal statement could never have contained. The palace apparatus was left entirely exposed. Outside the gates, people began arriving at the iron railings of Buckingham Palace on Thursday evening. No organized demonstration, no coordinated gathering. People simply showed up holding print editions whose front pages carried full-scale reproductions of Diana's handwriting. Some folded open to the third letter itself, held at chest height in the cooling evening air. They weren't protesting. They weren't chanting. They were just present, carrying that particular weighted stillness of people who have just learned something that permanently altered how they understand a story they believed they already knew. Flowers began appearing at the base of the railings. Single stems, small bunches, whatever people had with them or could find quickly. The kind of gesture made when emotion has filled every available interior space and requires something physical to move into the world. At Gatcombe Park, there were no cameras permitted at the gate. Anne's household issued no statement, granted no interviews, announced no public appearance. She maintained her silence through the most concentrated period of public attention her role in this story had ever generated. But one image did exist from that Thursday evening. A local photographer working a field assignment 400 m from the estate perimeter captured and walking out to the stables alone as the light was failing. No household staff, no visible awareness of the camera. She moved to the horse she had cared for across many years of daily routine and placed her hand against its neck in the unhurried way of someone for whom this particular gesture required no thought. She didn't look toward the palace. She didn't look toward the road. She looked out across the darkening Gloucester fields with an expression the photographer would spend the following morning trying to describe to his picture editor. Not grief, not relief, something quieter than either. The word he finally settled on was resolve, as though something that had been held open for a very long time that finally been allowed to close. The tabloids that had spent 3 decades calling her cold ran the image across their front pages without a caption that could improve upon it. So, what does this all mean? The palace lost control of a narrative they had spent 30 years managing. Not a single letter, but a sequence of letters composed across multiple days. Each one building deliberately on the last, now registered permanently in the public probate archive in Diana's own authenticated handwriting. The phrase she used in the second letter to describe what was being constructed around her, the sentence she wrote in the third about the woman she had misjudged, both now exist in the historical record without qualification, without institutional framing, without the softening that time and careful press management have been slowly applying to the 1990s. They cannot be retrieved. They cannot be recontextualized through a press release. They simply exist. What William gained by refusing to provide the palace with a joint statement was something of lasting strategic significance. He communicated without ambiguity that the future of the monarchy would not be built on the management of his mother's documented truth. The public understood. The palace understood, the correspondents who have covered this institution for decades understood, and the result was a moment in which the heir to the British throne was seen standing on the side of his mother's authenticated record rather than the apparatus that had spent 30 years constructing an alternative to it. What and revealed is that the woman the press spent 3 decades painting as emotionally unreachable has been publicly confirmed as the person Diana trusted most and as someone who honored that trust in the most exacting way imaginable. Not through a gesture, not through a carefully timed interview, but through 30 years of quiet, consistent, entirely uncelebrated action. Every adjusted holiday schedule, every private arrival at Windsor in a car without cameras, every hour spent with 2 grieving boys without press officers or announcements or any mechanism for converting private kindness into public credit. Every public caricature absorbed in silence rather than defended against by producing the documents that would have exonerated her instantly. That is a particular kind of character, and the public, having now seen the full picture assembled across 3 decades of court circular records and authenticated correspondence, is spending considerable time sitting quietly with it. What the key still holds is the repository Diana described in her final paragraph. It remains unopened. The trustees she appointed have not spoken publicly. The small piece of paper and placed beside the key in Charles Spencer's hand. The address written in Anne's own careful script of a location the palace has spent days attempting to independently verify has not yet been acted upon. Nothing has been confirmed. Nothing has been denied. What is known is only this: Diana built something durable. She chose her words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how to place a truth beyond the reach of the people most motivated to erase it. And she addressed it to the one person she believed would carry it with the courage and the silence that it required. She was right about Anne. After all, the question this story leaves behind, the one worth sitting with long after this video ends, is not what the repository contains. It is whether Anne was right to wait 30 years before opening the door.